Okay, we got it. Okay. So hello, everybody. I am Debbie Hockman. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture and Education at the David Posnack JCC. And I'm very happy that you all made it here. And I apologize greatly for our little technical difficulty, but I'm very proud of everybody for going with us and staying with us. And I know how it is when you read the book, you really want to talk about it. So that was tenacity of everybody. Thank you for doing that. And because we are thrilled as every month to be partnering with the Friends of Sterling Road Library to bring Lynda Levin to our screen to talk about this book. I also want to tell you, just to make sure everybody knows, we have the January registration is already up, so you can go ahead and register. But the book is Jojo Moyes, Giver of Stars. And the February book is American Dirt. So just so you're clear, January is Jojo Moyes and February is American Dirt. So we hope that you will join us for both of those, but you can go ahead and register already. And we have had people register already for January. So join us for that. We want to talk about how we're doing this interactively.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what we're going to do, and actually we may have a little bit smaller group today than we typically have. We are going to have and try to be interactive like we were last month. So what we ask of you is when Lynda puts a question out, is either to use the raise hand, which is found in your reactions down at the bottom. You can raise a hand and we know that you have a comment to make, or you can use the chat feature, which is also at the bottom of your screen, and you can write a comment and we will look at those. So that's the two ways to be part of the conversation. And we encourage you greatly to be a part of this because that's what makes it great for all of us to hear everybody who read the book, since everybody has different opinions, and that makes this always an interesting conversation. So again, thank you all for being here, and I am going to turn it over to the lovely Lynda Levin.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So also, because we're a little bit of a smaller group, please feel free to speak. Okay, so because that's the beauty of this group. We really like having a discussion versus just a regular straight review. So let me jump right in to tell you a little bit about the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Let me give you a little background. And again, there's so much information. I'm going to I tried to consolidate it as much as I could. And the same with a lot of the symbolism and whatnot about the story itself. But F. Scott Fitzgerald was named for a famous relative, Francis Scott Key, though he was always referred to as Scott. He was born in Minnesota, educated at Princeton, published his first novel, This Side of Paradise, in 1920, and it achieved critical and popular acclaim. That same year, he married Zelda Sayer, who was considered the queen of Montgomery, Alabama youth in society. And actually, as I read a little about her, exactly like Daisy in the story. And the two Fitzgeralds, they lived a boisterous, decadent life in New York City. He published The Beautiful and the Damned in 1922, which also described the boisterous life of the 1920s cafe society. The couple ended up moving to France to continue their extravagant lifestyle, and they befriended Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, and they became part of this group, this legendary group, which was called the Lost Generation, this group of expatriate writers and artists. And it was while he was in Paris that he wrote his third and perhaps his finest novel, The Great Gatsby, in 1925. He told his publisher that he wanted to write something new.
Lynda, hold on one sec. Everybody, please make sure that you are on mute.
Okay, but here's the bad news. That's actually my phone.
Oh.
So, and I have a secretary by the name of Shelley Levin, who's supposed to be answering the phone.
Okay.
So I think you must have taken a coffee break. Okay.
That's very funny. But everyone else, please make sure you're on mute as well.
Yes, okay.
Not Lynda.
Okay, that was ironic that it was my phone. Okay, so anyways, in 1925 in Paris, he published The Great Gatsby. He told his publisher he wanted to write something new, something extraordinary, something beautiful and intricately patterned, and he did it. The problem was when it was published, although Hemingway and other writers really thought it was wonderful, unfortunately, financially, it was not successful. So here they were, they had this lavish lifestyle, the Fitzgeralds, and he was constantly plagued by financial difficulties, which later necessitated his writing of commercial short stories and many scripts for Hollywood, something he really detested. His wife Zelda was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1930 and suffered mental health issues all of her life. She was hospitalized in 1932 in Baltimore. And it was while he was living in Baltimore in 1934 that he wrote Tender is the Night. Now, a lot of people have seen this book as a thinly veiled autobiographical novel that told all about his problems with Zelda, with the deleterious effects of wealth and his decadent lifestyle. Critics have said it also showed his big battle with alcoholism. It too did not sell particularly well, but like The Great Gatsby, its reputation has since risen significantly. In time, Fitzgerald and Zelda became estranged. He was very angry that she had published her own novel, Save Me the Waltz, about their lives in Europe. And he was so angry that he succeeded in getting her doctors to agree and not allow her to write anymore. She continued living in mental institutions on the East Coast while he lived with his lover, Sheila Graham, a well-known gossip columnist in Hollywood. Fitzgerald had been an alcoholic since college, and he was known as such a heavy drinker in the 1920s. He was left in very poor health in the 1930s. He suffered 2 heart attacks, and he died December 21st of 1940. He was actually waiting for a visit from the doctor, and he passed away in Sheila Graham's apartment when he was only 44 years old. His last novel, The Last Tycoon, was published posthumously. So it's interesting, in the edition that I have, and I know people had different editions of the book, but in the one I had, there is a foreword that's written by Eleanor Lanahan, who was Fitzgerald's granddaughter. And she speaks about her mother, Frances Scott Fitzgerald, who was the only child born to Scott and Zelda. Scotty, as she was known, was born in 1921 and remembered her father, F. Scott Fitzgerald, as being devoted but very difficult. He raised her as a single parent since Zelda was hospitalized for much of her life. Scotty rarely spoke about her family. She never really bragged about her father. His reputation at that point was so tarnished by his alcoholism. And the granddaughter tells us that when Fitzgerald died, he was pretty much penniless. Scotty did a good job of shielding her children from any negative fallout from her parents' legacy of alcoholism and mental illness. So Eleanor, the granddaughter, never even read any of his novels until she herself entered her freshman year in college. It's ironic, when The Great Gatsby was published, some of the reviews called it overrated and forgettable. Now, 95 years later, it's regularly named as one of the greatest novels ever written in English. The book is less than 50,000 words, and yet it continues to have such enduring appeal. There have been stage versions made of this story. Ballet works, his long overlooked poems, his letters, and his stories. It's been filmed at least 5 times. The first was a silent film in 1926, and a black and white noir thriller in 1949, and then in 1974 with Robert Redford, and most recently in 2013 with Leonardo DiCaprio, which, by the way, if you haven't seen the movie, I recommend that you watch it, even watch it a second time. You'll see how it was really easy for them to film that because he gave them such description in the book that they were able to just take that and create the beautiful visual images. The boost for the book, The Great Gatsby, came when it was issued as an armed services edition, a small pocket-sized book. It was a paperback given to 150,000 soldiers during the World War II, and that introduced the book to all of these American men and families. And by the mid-1960s, Fitzgerald's books were all included in college curriculums. Let me set the stage for you about the setting of the book. Picture that the 1920s were after World War I, right? It had just ended. There was this great sense of liberation, and it led to what we all know as the Roaring Twenties, or the Jazz Age. It was the time of Prohibition, and of course the ban on alcohol had unbelievably backfired. The economy was growing by leaps and bounds, and by the latter part of the decade, the United States had become the wealthiest country in the world. We had mass production, which created a massive consumer economy. Women won the right to vote. Women were appearing more in the workplace. Appliances were becoming very common in the home. People were leaving the rural communities, moving to the cities. So there was all kinds of freedom. There was all kinds of free time. There was disposable income more than in any previous generation. And there was also a huge pronounced chasm between society's haves and have-nots. The rich were admired for their wealth. They had all kinds of tax advantages. They had all of these, they had and luxurious homes and radios and phones. Many of these things were out of reach for the average American. And so it was at this time that the concept of the American dream became an accepted goal. The idea that every American should have the equal opportunity to attain success and prosperity as a result of his hard work, his determination, and his initiative. With all of that, he should be able to achieve the American dream. So that's sort of the setting here. And the summary of the book, I want to give you a brief summary for those of you who have perhaps not read it or just to refresh your memory. We meet, first of all, Nick Carraway. He is from the Midwest and he loves the Midwest, but he's sort of, it's kind of boring, and he decides he served in the war in World War I. He's come back and now he's moves to West Egg on Long Island. He wants the excitement of the East Coast. And he happens to live next door to Jay Gatsby, a wealthy businessman who's known for his lavish parties. So Nick goes to visit his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom, and they live in a different area of Long Island that's called East Egg. Their lifestyle is very luxurious, and they introduce him to Jordan Baker, who's a single professional golfer. And Nick, along with Jordan, they are enjoying this way of life, but they're also seeing how shallow it is. He also has the opportunity to meet Tom's mistress, Myrtle Wilson, who lives in a place called the Valley of Ashes, which is exactly as it sounds, with her husband, George, who owns the rundown gas station there. Nick and Gatsby become friends, and even after Nick realizes that Gatsby is pursuing the friendship in part so he can reconnect with Daisy, who happens to be the woman that he fell in love with before the war, Nick is kind of intrigued with this story. So at Gatsby's request, Nick arranges for Daisy and Gatsby to reunite at his home over tea. Although that first meeting between the two former lovers is awkward, Daisy and Gatsby continue to see each other secretly. And eventually, on one incredibly hot afternoon, this group of friends spend the day. They rent a suite at the Plaza Hotel, and it is there that Tom confronts Gatsby, and he finds out that his suspicions are correct, that Daisy does indeed love Gatsby and plans to leave Tom. So meanwhile, we have George Wilson. He starts to suspect that his wife Myrtle is having an affair, but he has no idea with whom. George decides there's one way to handle it. He locks his wife upstairs. He wants to keep her safe and away from her lover until he can get enough money to take her away. The problem is that his wife Myrtle, who's locked upstairs, she looks out the window. And all of a sudden she sees a car and she thinks it's her lover, Tom, outside. And she breaks out of the room and she runs downstairs hoping that Tom will whisk her away from this horrible life that she has with her husband in this god-awful place of the Valley of Ashes. The problem is it is not Tom in the car. Rather, she is struck and killed by Gatsby's car, which Daisy is driving back from the confrontation they had all had at the plaza. Instead of stopping to help, Daisy drives away from the scene of the accident. George, as you can imagine, is distraught, and he is determined to find the driver of the car. And for Tom, this turns out to be a wonderful opportunity. He is still reeling from the news of Daisy and Gatsby's affair, and he goes ahead and he tells George that the car belongs to Jay Gatsby. And of course, in his grief, George manages to locate Gatsby's mansion, and he murders him in his pool before taking his own life. Nick is devastated when he hears of Gatsby's death, and he gets to take on the responsibility of the funeral arrangements because no one else will do it. He is saddened that none of Gatsby's many friends who showed up at all those parties, no one will even attend the funeral. Only Gatsby's father shows up, and that's when Nick learns the true story of this kid whose name was James Gatz. He was a poor young man who grew up as a dirt farmer's son in the Midwest and ultimately turned himself into the great Jay Gatsby, all in the pursuit of wealth and his vision of the American dream. At the end of the story, Nick is so disillusioned, he leaves the East Coast and he returns to the Midwest. So it's a very simple story, actually, right? Very straightforward. So one of the things that makes this book a classic, and I want to talk about that a little bit more at the end, but I want to focus in on the style of writing. So what did you think of the style of writing? Some of you said when we did a little informal poll in the beginning that you didn't really love the book, didn't care for it. How did you all feel about his style of writing? Okay, well, I will just tell you one thing for sure, is that that's one of the reasons why the book has continued to be a classic. Go ahead, Kathy. Kathy, did you have something?
Yes, I did appreciate his style of writing. I enjoyed actually all the vocabulary that I didn't know rather, and kept looking. I use a Kindle, so I was looking up all these words that I'd never heard of. But I found that fascinating, and I did like his style of writing, but I couldn't get into the book. I stopped halfway through and watched the 1974 movie,
Oh,
which
that
I really enjoyed actually. But I came away wondering why it was such a classic. And so I'm really interested in hearing that, because I think I just missed something significant here.
I will tell you, it's so interesting, Kathy, that this book is not only, it hasn't always been considered a classic. I have really had a good time discussing this book before meeting with you guys, because my 10th grade granddaughter is currently studying The Great Gatsby. Because this is an English teacher's dream. Every single page that you pull out, you could do a whole class with. There's so much to talk about in the way of his language, in the way of his symbolism, and we'll touch on a little bit of that. What I was so struck with is the description, right? And again, those of you that perhaps saw the 2013 movie, there is a scene when Nick, for the first time, comes to Tom and Daisy's house. And he walks in, and it's this magnificent scene, in the film of what this room looks like. And this is how Fitzgerald describes it. He's telling this story. Nick walks into the room. A breeze blew through the room, blue curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as the wind does on the sea. You know what? The guy who did the set design on this, all he had to do was follow the directions that Fitzgerald wrote. That's so true with so many of the different scenes in the movie. So there's all these descriptions of the house. There's descriptions of the parties. There's the glamour of the people. There's the unusual turns of phrase. At one point in I'm sorry, I just did myself. Can you hear me? Yeah. There was one where it said, instead of saying, we were driving and this hearse drove by, he writes, a dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with flowers. So he just has this turn of phrase. At one point, Jordan Baker says, she really likes large parties. Large parties are more intimate. Smaller parties have no privacy. It really makes you think, what is she really getting at here? And when you think about it, you understand what she's actually saying. And there's great symbolism. One of the key symbols in this story is the green light. Do you know what scene I'm talking about? In the very beginning, the very first image that we see is when Nick sees Gatsby. Now, Nick is next door. He looks out there on the lawn. What does he see? He sees his neighbor. And this is what he describes. I saw him. He looked like he was content to be alone. He sees that he stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way. I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked again once more for Gatsby, he had vanished and I was alone in the unquiet darkness. So the question is, because what keeps appearing is his fascination with the green light. So what do you think he's getting at with the green light? And of course, it will become clearer as we even talk more about the story. What do you think he's, by the way, you know what? I have to tell you something. I can only see, Debbie, I can only see one screen here.
Right. So that's what I was going to say to everybody. Raising your hand is not going, we have 3 screens actually going on all at one time.
Yeah.
So
It's not working. The hand raising's not working.
it is working because we have actually I have a couple of people with hands, but you could also use the chat and write your comments in the chat.
And just say,
Is the clap the hand? Is that what the clap is?
In the
if
reaction,
you try,
you should
you know
have,
what? Even if you do the clap, that'll be fine. Just
In
hit
the
whatever.
reactions, I just have a clapping hand, not a raised hand.
Okay, so Debbie, is it okay if they just use that and that'll call attention to them?
Yeah.
Okay,
But in the meantime, you do have a couple of people with raised hands and you also have a couple comments going on, not about the green light, but that were up here before. So I'm not sure. One is
It's me.
Yeah.
It's me. It's Leslie.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, first of all, the green light is on the end of Daisy's property, at the end of her dock. And I think it's kind of symbolic that it's green because it kind of gives Gatsby the go-ahead to keep dreaming. And I was going to say about the description that I'm not a big fan of description. Sometimes I sort of skip over it, but I didn't skip over any of the description in this book because it was so beautiful and so well done.
the
We
language
also have Stephanie has her hand up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, I did think his descriptions and his use of language is quite extraordinary. I also think that he refers, Gatsby has this vision of, I guess what he called the green, the orgastic future, the sort of ultimate hopefulness and possibility that the future hold. And somehow that I think the green light on Daisy's property and what Gatsby saw as the green light for possibilities are the tie-in.
And Jane also has her hand up. Jane Kaplan.
Okay, so it's interesting because that intricate style, which is so descriptive, and I found it very beautiful. And I didn't want to miss any of it. It did the opposite for me. It didn't make me not want to read it. It made me want to take my time to read it. And yet the story is so simple. And what comes to mind is because Daisy is crazy. We know already fairly early on that Daisy is a crazy character. And the fact that in her real life, she ended up with schizophrenia.
That's Zelda. You're talking about Zelda's his wife.
Zelda. I'm
You're talking about
Zelda. Yeah, Daisy, Zelda.
Daisy,
But
well, Daisy,
it's this extreme, the simplicity of the story with the extreme descriptiveness of the style. Now, I don't know, I haven't read all his other books or even any of his other books, so I don't know if that's always his style, but the fact that it made me think of her and Zelda and how he was drawn to this extraordinarily complex person, and yet the book itself is, I like what Stephanie said, was so hopeful. He was a supreme optimist, but it was so simple, such a simple story. And that dichotomy was just strong.
exactly. So where Zelda and Daisy seem to be similar is in their class, right? That they are sort of upper class and that kind of thing. Daisy, we don't really have insight here that she is crazy. We just, that's something, he did not really portray that here in this book. Tender in the Night, he definitely talks much more about Zelda,
Right.
makes it much more like that.
But knowing that she helped me understand why the complex style and the very simple story. I don't know. That's just what came to mind.
Such a good point. I want to get back to what I don't know if it was Stephanie, perhaps it was Leslie, who was talking about the color green, the go for it color. I'm telling you, there are pages of professors that have written what that green light stands for. And so a lot of it was the idea of idea of green, the idea of going after money, going after Daisy together. And one of them said he's reaching out to Daisy, hoping to rekindle their past. And at the same time, what is he doing? He's reaching out for the attainment of the American dream. In seeing that green light, he is filled with determination, optimism, and hope. And he's hoping that all that he's worked so hard for are going to pay off. And what's the payoff? The attainment of Daisy and of course, there's so much symbolism as we continue, we'll see. The weather in the story, when he describes the weather actually affects the plot. And not just the weather, but he uses the colors, the idea of gray being the Valley of Ashes, yellow being the color of, the color of Daisy's dress. And it's the color of gold, the idea of gold and yellow is repeated in the story. So you get this idea of money. On the other hand, it's also a color of death as the story progresses. So I want to move on and I want to say to you, okay, so what would you say are the themes in the book? What themes do you see? Well, I'll start us out. The whole idea of social class division. Yes? So picture that every character in this story is representative of different classes and things that were going on, the way society was rigidly structured in the 20s. So that's one thing that would be a theme, the social class divisions. What other themes did you see?
There's a couple coming in on the chat. And wealth, jealousy, desperation, class, they're agreeing. And Jackie said, I agree, wealth and what really is the American dream.
Yeah. What else does it show you? To me, it shows the moral decay underneath a lot of it, a lot of the corruption. Did you get that sense when you were reading it? He talks a lot about truth and lies and love. But what really stood out for me was the whole idea of reality versus the dream. Okay, the reality of who Daisy was, what his whole striving was, what's the reality versus what is the dream. The physical setting of the book is also very interesting. We've got the West Egg, if you recall, that was where the nouveau riche lived, right? Where Gatsby had bought this monstrosity of a house, this ostentatious, gaudy hotel. And then there was East Egg, which was the old money. And that's where Tom and Daisy live. And that's where the aristocracy lives. And you get the feeling of this aimless, they don't need to work. They are just sort of living off of family money. We see New York City being one of the settings. It's, Nick is loves the raciness of it, the adventurousness of it, the excitement, the money, the fun, the impersonal nature of New York City. And contrasting to that, we get the Valley of Ashes. And of course, the Valley of Ashes is located on the train. It's halfway between West Egg and New York City. And of course, the Valley of Ashes is exactly that. It is a desolate, poverty-stricken little town. Everything is gray, including Mr. Wilson, who owns the garage, and it's his wife, Myrtle, who's having the affair with Tom, right? This is what we end up seeing. And of course, what's the prevalent, what's the symbol in Valley of Ashes? Do you remember? Outside, yeah. Go, just, you could, yeah.
The eyes.
The eyes.
The doctor
Yes.
eyes.
All of a sudden there's this faded billboard, right? And it's Dr. Eckelberg, who one time may have had a thriving practice somewhere near there, but he has since long ago left. And there's this worn out kind of a billboard with these all-seeing eyes, which turn out to be a major symbol later on in the story. So I want to talk now a little bit about Nick. He was the narrator. What can you share about Nick? What did you think about Nick? Any thoughts about him? Well, I'll start us out. He's got a very privileged background, right? He himself he's Daisy's cousin, and he's reporting about all these people and he's making judgments about them. But at the same time, what's interesting is he himself is he came from this similar background. And we also know that he's learned a lot of lessons from his father. He considers himself somewhat morally superior, right? He says at one point his father told him, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. So that's something that his father is trying to teach him. And his father also says to him, you know, not everybody has got a sense of the fundamental decencies. Those fundamental decencies are parceled out unequally at birth. So he already does have a sense of decency, and he does have a sense of right and wrong. And he is the one who's our narrator. Any other comments about Nick?
Lynda, Renee mentioned that he's lonely, and Eileen is saying that he was just good friends to Jay, that he was a good friend to Jay.
He was a very dear friend to Jay, and we see that later on, right, in the story as it progresses. So here's Nick, and he has these strong feelings about Gatsby. So let's talk about that. What are his feelings for Gatsby? What does he think about Gatsby? Because he's actually the way we first meet Gatsby.
We have Leslie has her hand up and Stephanie has her hand.
Okay, well, I had my hand up for before, but I will say that Nick is very fond of Gatsby, and I think it really shows in the end when he's trying to get people to come to his funeral. I thought that was really sad, you know, that nobody really showed up, and he felt the sadness there. One of the critics that I read said that perhaps Nick was in love with Gatsby. I don't know if that's carrying it too far, perhaps.
You know, Leslie, I want to talk about two of your points, but the idea of him being in love, it's so interesting. One of the other reasons this book is considered a classic is that it is still relevant today, and every generation has had their own unique appreciation and interpretation of the book. And yes, that is sort of a modern, you know, a lot of people have said that it's very possible that he was actually in love with Gatsby. But we do see, if not that, then we do see that he was a very dear friend. And as you bring out, Leslie, also at the very end, it's very sad, isn't it? He realizes that no one is interested in even arranging the funeral, and he takes it on. He says, everyone has some vague right at the end to someone taking a personal interest in them. He says, I wanted to go into the room where Jay lay and reassure him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry, just trust me. I'm going to get some people to come for you. So you see his desperation and his sadness at the end. Any other thoughts about his relationship, of course, with Gatsby?
You have a couple comments here. Kathy said that she thinks Nick is conflicted about Gatsby, but ultimately feels loyal to him and cares deeply for him. And Jackie said she wondered about Nick being in love with Gatsby.
Right.
And Eileen said, was Nick in love with Jordan?
Yeah, with Gatsby.
Ah, good point. Okay, so backing up to, well, first of all, as far as Jordan and Nick, were they in love? I don't think so. At the very end, you kind of see where it was sort of a convenient, superficial. My opinion was that they really weren't. And he says it was really more of, quote, a tender curiosity they had for her. And of course, it's funny because at the end, she says to him, you know, I've never been thrown over before, and I really don't like it. And plus, I'm engaged to someone else. That's sort of how she takes it at the end. So we see that. But the idea also going back to, I was at Jackie, I'm not sure who said it, about the idea of him being conflicted, Nick, about Gatsby. Totally he was. He knew that Nick was lying about things. He knew that Gatsby was lying about things. Do you remember that part?
Yes.
There's one part where he's driving in the car. He's driving, Nick is going with Gatsby. Gatsby is going to take him to lunch with Wolfsheim. Remember that scene? And Nick says, "Listen, good old sport. I want to tell you about my background." And he starts to make up all this stuff. And Nick says at one point, "I have to hold myself back from laughing." At one point, Gatsby says, "I grew up very rich. I had wealthy parents. They died, and I grew up in the middle." Nick says to him, "Where in the Middle West?" He says, "Oh, San Francisco." So right away, you know, he's trying to hold back the laughter. But then Gatsby goes ahead and shows him a war medal. He shows him a picture of himself at Oxford. And all of a sudden he wants to believe in And so of course you see where he all of a sudden he's authentic. So he does have that conflict. Any other thoughts?
Jackie did have her hand up and so did Stephanie. I don't know if they still had to comment about this or they had their hands up though.
Yeah. So first of all, the fact is that Nick is a narrator, sort of puts him in a kind of unique position as somewhat of an observer. He starts off definitely as an observer. I think he's fairly open to all these characters that he meets, and somewhat, although he tries to understand everybody, he's fairly non-critical. So he sort of plays a very interesting role throughout. But then as the story progresses, you're seeing him sort of being drawn in right into the action, which
Yes.
I think is an interesting way of having a narrator.
Right. His objectivity definitely changes as the story progresses, right? Exactly. Any other thoughts you want to finish up on that with the way he's feeling about Gatsby? Okay, so yeah.
Okay, somehow my hand up never gets posted, but anyway. I thought that Nick was a really great moderator because of his background and because he sort of had like the Midwest values that he was coming in with to the decadent New York environment. He just sort of, to me, he balanced what he was able to see in New York and give a different perspective of it than anybody who was originally from New York. So I like that. I love the language. I thought after reading so many popular fiction, this is like a breath of fresh air. So I totally appreciated how the writing went. And I read it very slowly. I didn't do a scanning at all. All in all, I found it very interesting. And I also saw the DiCaprio film, and I thought that they stayed quite close to the book, except the way they opened it and ended. They took liberty to do it differently. And I thought it stayed well with the book, though.
Yes,
and
I did.
The green light from the I mean, I thought it was well balanced in that they opened it with the green light and they ended it with the green light. And to me, that was hope.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I want to move on to the character of Tom Buchanan. I thought it was a very powerful character. What do you want to say about Tom Buchanan? Well, I can start us out. First of all, physically, he was very handsome. He was a former football star. Now, I want to read you because I want to show you another example of the writing that is so powerful. So this is the time when Nick comes up to Tom and Daisy's house, and Nick is standing outside ready to greet Nick. Tom is standing outside ready to meet Nick. Shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face. Nick is looking at Tom and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. Isn't that an amazing description of someone? You really get the feeling of what we're going to see in Tom's behavior later on.
You have a couple of comments about Tom. Stephanie said he was strong and cruel. Jackie said he was a bully. Kathy said he was a racist and a bully who put himself above and before others. We also got disliked Tom. And he was mean and controlling, a terrible temper. That was Marlene. And Judith said he felt entitled. And I know that Jane had her hand up, as well as Mark London, which is not Mark London, and Jackie.
So, Marilyn, did you have something?
I just thought he was very extremely prejudiced and probably very accurate for the time. But as I'm seeing him, to me, I'm thinking like Archie Bunker would be saying the same things as Tom was saying. But of course, Archie didn't have this privilege, but he was as prejudiced, and you know, I went all along with that personality.
That personality in that time period. Exactly. Yeah.
I was going to say the same thing. He just didn't have the money. He was very much like Archie Bunker, very much a bully, but he didn't have the money. And I also thought he was fairly typical, but that's one of the things I didn't like about the book. I thought most of the characters were pretty typical or stereotypical of what people think of that time.
Right. So Jackie, one of the points that I thought about the book is you're right, they were stereotypical, and I actually think that's what Fitzgerald was actually showing us. I think he wanted us to see Daisy and Tom as a certain strata, you know, certain stratosphere of society, and I think he was showing us something with Myrtle and with George Wilson in the Valley of Ashes. Remember, we said in this period of time there was a huge chasm between the classes in society, so I think he is really showing that to us. You're right. That was very stereotypical in that way.
Also,
Any other
Jane Kaplan had a comment to make.
Yeah, Jane.
Wait, Jane, we got to unmute you.
Jane, you're muted.
You know that Daisy is a focus for Gatsby, and yet you have a hint that she's never going to leave Tom, because Tom somehow, in his bulliness and his pompousness, in his arrogance and his wealth, gives her a sense of feeling safe and strong somehow. And that you have a sense somewhere middle of the book, there's a comment that she'll never leave him. And at that moment, I said, that's probably true. She's probably never going to leave him.
Right.
And so his bulliness, his brashness, it sort of accentuated to me her weakness, that she was actually attracted to that brashness, that bulliness, that it gave her some sense of she'd be okay, even though she wasn't happy and in love with this man. He would keep her safe somehow.
He would keep her safe, and he would keep her in the social position, which is what she really wanted.
Right.
So you guys have hit on everything that I had made notes about, how mean he was, how arrogant he was, how he taunted Gatsby, even at the very end. When they have this confrontation in the Plaza hotel room, he goes ahead and he says to Daisy, you go with Gatsby in the car. Now, that was so arrogant. He knew very well that she was never going to leave. Tom knew very well she was never going to leave him. And so he wasn't threatened in the least. He goes ahead and he sends the two of them back in the car. And in the same way, he taunted George Wilson. He kept saying, I'm going to sell you the car. I'm going to sell you a car. And he knew the guy was desperate for money, but he kept sort of taunting him and teasing him with that. And of course, we know he's a real lowlife. We know that he, right after their honeymoon, he and Daisy, he's found in a car accident with a hotel's chambermaid. And we know he's violent, right? He goes ahead and he smacks Myrtle across and breaks her nose. Yeah, so we see all of these different things. And the other thing that really struck me is what a hypocrite he was. It was okay for him to go ahead and have all these affairs, but he went crazy when he suspects that Daisy is having an affair with Gatsby. Any other comments before we move on?
There were a couple in the chat about Arlene had mentioned that everyone's shallow people. Kathy had said it was a powerful scene when Gatsby meets Daisy and Tom's daughter, and that's when she knew that Daisy would never leave him. And Arlene also said that she needed to be taken care of, Daisy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments? Okay, moving on. I want to talk about Myrtle, because Myrtle, to me, when you really analyze this, she was really a parallel character to Gatsby. So why do I say that? Because she is part of the working class, right? And she is desperate to get out of it. And in the same way that Gatsby is looking at Daisy and he's got this American dream idea of getting ahead and moving into this upper class, so is Myrtle. She has that same idea. Tom is her ticket. She's got this, she wanted more out of life than she had, and she had a taste of another life through Tom. And she thought it would be possible that she and Tom would end up together. She actually thought that. In the same way that Gatsby was so misguided, he actually thought that this was going to work out with Daisy. Any other comments about Myrtle?
Stephanie said Myrtle wants to get ahead.
She does. You know what else was interesting about Myrtle? Do you remember the scene where they have this apartment in Morningside Heights where Tom has this apartment where he meets with Myrtle, and Myrtle, when she goes there, changes her clothes, and when she changes her clothes, what happens? Fitzgerald writes, Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume sometime before. She was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. Intense vitality had been now converted into impressive hauteur. And all of a sudden, she becomes a different person. And I love the fact that at one point, when they send this kid out to get some ice for their drinks, Myrtle says, "Oh, I told that boy about the ice." Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. These people, you have to keep after them all the time, which is so funny, right?
Jackie commented that Myrtle became in the apartment exactly what she hated from the upper class.
That's
And
right.
Arlene said she wants to belong. And then Kathy is asking, are Myrtle and Gatsby sacrificial lambs?
Yeah, exactly. Of course, there's great irony in the end. All she wants is to get out of the Valley of Ashes. And what happens instead? She is struck dead in the road under the faded billboard of Dr. Eckelberg's eyeglasses. And she's never able to get out of the Valley of Ashes. She dies there. Yeah, so there's great irony in that. And so in the end, she's sort of destroyed. And in the end, we sort of see the same thing with Gatsby. Any thoughts about George as we move on, or anything else about the Wilsons? George struck me as such a sad guy. You know, he actually loved his wife. He was trying so hard to hang on to her. He had his suspicions, and he's a very moral guy. He believes in right and wrong. He believes in right and wrong. Anyone have any thoughts on George before we move on?
Kathy thinks that George is the most tragic character.
Yes, he is.
And we also have Leslie has her hand up to make a comment.
Okay. I recall the mention of a dog leash and dog's
Yes.
biscuits, but I can't seem to recall a dog. Was there a dog that I
Yes.
forgot about?
Yes. And this was one of the weird things with Myrtle. You know, as soon as she gets with Tom, she becomes this different persona. And so all of a sudden she says to Tom, "Oh, you know what? See these little dogs? I would like to buy one of these little dogs." And she
Okay.
goes ahead and she buys this little dog, right? And of course, at the end, it's powerful because George finds the little leash. And that's one of the things that confirms his suspicions that she's having an affair, because where is the dog? But yeah, that was just one more of her, one more action that she takes that shows what a different person she becomes.
Right.
Yeah, so George becomes, as you point out, one of the most tragic characters in the story, because he's unfortunately, he is manipulated by Tom, right? We know Tom is so duplicitous. He knows exactly what's going to happen when he lets George know that that car was Gatsby's car. He knows that George is a very moral and upstanding guy who believes that, you know what, wrongs need to be righted. And therefore, he's going to go after Gatsby. And of course, the other thing I thought was so sad was that in the end, even in his death, he provides the easy excuse, the cover up for Daisy's hit and run. Because in the end, what do the police do with this case? They don't look into it deeply. They say, "Oh yeah, he was deranged in grief. And that's why he killed this guy in the pool." So what you see is that really, even in his death, he was a cover up for Daisy. Anything else now, as far as anything that we learn later on about Gatsby? We know that his ostentatious lifestyle is really a charade. It's all a cover up with one goal in mind, and that is for Daisy and, of course, for his attainment of the American dream. He makes up all these things about his background. Any other things you would want to talk about with Gatsby? Anything else that you want to mention about him? He's got this very formal method of speaking. Anything else about him?
Jackie has her hand up.
I actually thought Gatsby was really pretty sad, to be honest with you. It was like he was always searching for something and he never fit anywhere.
I agree with you. I agree with you. He was a very sad character.
Leslie also has her hand up. Oh, Leslie, you're on mute.
Unmute. I read today that there were 5 versions of this movie. I had no idea. One of them, I think, was a silent film or way back when. Can you imagine? But the one that I always recall is with Robert Redford as Gatsby instead of the DiCaprio one, even though I saw both of them. So I'm always picturing Robert Redford. So, you know, he can do no wrong.
Leonardo DiCaprio plays a pretty good part too, though, in the 2013
Yes.
version. You're right.
Yes.
So Gatsby, we see him as a very pitiful and a very tragic character also. We do get to see a different side of him when he has that meeting with Daisy. And of course, he's reuniting with her over tea at Nick's house. And we see he has set it up, right? It's so theatrical. She's theatrical, and we see that this whole scene is theatrical. He is make sure that the lawn is cut properly. There's lots of artifice. Gatsby is very awkward in the beginning, right? It's contrived. Even his entrance is contrived. And here's a cute thing that Fitzgerald does. You know what happens in this scene? And you see it in the movie too. He knocks over a clock. He drops the clock. So why is that interesting? What's the symbol there?
Marilyn has her hand up.
Well, I don't know if this ties in, but one thing I've noticed about Gatsby, which I thought was important, is that he was striving to create this world for himself. And the comment that Fitzgerald made was, you can't go back again.
Yes.
And maybe when the clock, something happens with the clock, you can, time doesn't stand still. Time moves forward and it doesn't go backwards.
Exactly.
So maybe that all ties in together.
That absolutely ties in. That's right. I think that's really what he's saying there, is that you cannot control time.
Also, you have Stephanie saying almost time is lost, and Renee said the clock and time gets jostled. So
what we see with him is that he goes through a lot of different emotions when he first reunites with her. He goes through this whole feeling of being, first he's kind of embarrassed, and then we see that he's filled with this sense of wonder. And it's almost, Nick says, I think when he takes her on a tour of his house, he says, I think he revalued everything in the house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. So, you know, he was so smitten with her. He just wanted her to see everything, to appreciate everything that he had. We see this whole other side. All of a sudden, the theatrics are kind of gone, and you almost kind of see this real pathetic character that he is.
Lynda, there was a comment from Chris who says, how much was Gatsby's lifestyle supposed to mirror Fitzgerald's, or was it supposed to be pure fiction?
Well, I think that people say that all of his books really had a lot of autobiographical input. And actually, when you read about the kind of life that they had, him and Zelda, yeah, it's very possible that a lot of that is very similar. Anything else?
There was a comment from Arlene that he was upset that she didn't wait for him after the war. And Renee said that, and his father has that reaction too. He's smitten.
Yes. What's interesting too is that at one point Nick makes a very interesting observation. He says that when during this meeting, he says, you know, that all of a sudden there's this great sense of wonder that Gatsby is feeling, and Nick wonders himself, does she actually match up to what his idealization of her was? And Nick says, and this is Fitzgerald's writing, there must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart. Could she live up to the illusion? Did she? Well, that's a question. Because we wonder how is Daisy actually depicted in reality versus what the illusion was, what his dream was. How do we see her in the story?
Linda, Jane had her hand up.
Oh.
You've moved on to something else now. So I was back a little bit when I started to put my hand up, and that is that his entire existence there was based on the possibility of meeting Daisy again, reconnecting to Daisy again. Everything about the location of his house, the gaudiness of his house, the fact that he was actually such a lonely character, he was looking to her to fill him up. And I don't know, the American dream had to do with wealth. Well, he had a lot of wealth already. I don't know, it was a different kind of part of the American dream, like the wife, the kids, and the whole bit. But his whole life was based on trying to meet Daisy again once he met her, where he chose to live, the green light, everything.
Yeah, it's true. That was his dream. He had this dream of her, and he had this dream of her of the way she was back in Louisville 5 years before when they had met. Is that how she is now? How do we see her now? The thing we see of her, she's lying luxuriously on a couch and she's smoking at total ease, seemingly without a care in the world. And you see how theatrical she is. She's, I'm paralyzed with happiness, she says to him. So right away you get a feeling of this drama queen that she is. Anything that you noted about Daisy? Well, her voice is mentioned many times, and that's another thing that's interesting in this story. He calls it a low, thrilling voice. And later they say, what kind of a voice was it? Well, it's the voice of money. There was something about her that was so appealing, and there was something that men went crazy over her voice. What else do we see about her?
Stephanie commented that it's almost like Daisy is the illusion of the American dream. Arlene commented that she's in a dream world. Jane commented that she's sexy.
She's sexy, she's beautiful, she's wealthy. Everything is effortless. And these are all the things that he's looking for. These are all the things that attracted him. And she says to him, this is what attracted him. What we see is a very shallow kind of a woman who tells him herself how bored and cynical she is about everything. She says, I've had a very bad time, Nick. I'm cynical about everything. I think everything is terrible. And she calls herself sophisticated in a hollow way. But there is something also interesting about her. And what does she say when her daughter is born? What does she say she noted? When her daughter is born, she says, I hope she'll be a beautiful fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. And why would she say that? She knows firsthand how important it is to be beautiful. And she hopes that her daughter will be enough of a fool that she won't realize how difficult it is to be a woman in a society that values only beauty and emptiness and superficiality in a woman, that allows women to be treated so poorly by men. And so she herself is no fool. And yet You know, a lot of the reviewers talk about the fact that she actually had more depth to her, the fact that she could even see that, but that she has chosen to live this life of shallowness because that is what society demanded of her. What else do we know about her? How about at the end? At the end, one of the things I thought was so end. She's driving. She tells Gatsby she wants to drive when they leave the Plaza Hotel, right? She tells him nervous she wants to drive, so they drive. They go through the Valley of Ashes, and what happens? She hits Myrtle, and what does she do? He encourages her to stop, but she doesn't. She drives on. And so what does that say about her? To me, it shows how little concern she had for the fact that she hit somebody. And we see that that's really a characteristic of hers.
We have a comment from Stephanie. There you go.
Stephanie?
I'm unmuting.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, you know what? It's so funny because you say that she wasn't a fool, and that makes her more unlikable to
Yes,
me.
more unlikable.
The fact that she then understood and she used herself and her position, and she was a manipulator. I saw her as a manipulator, a user, totally loyal only to what her needs were, not to Tom, not to Gatsby, and not even to the little girl. She never shows an ounce of affection to the little girl. I'm not going to say anything more, but she reminds me of somebody in today's political world.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So the other thing that strikes me about her is not only does she show very little concern for her daughter, and we see where she had very little concern for Myrtle, but she has so little concern for Gatsby. So here's Gatsby. He is willing to take the blame, right? He's going to cover for her. He's going to say, okay, I was the one driving. He's prepared to do that. And in fact, she has no concern for Gatsby. She leaves him. That was such a sad scene towards the end of the book. He's waiting outside of her house after this confrontation at the plaza. He thinks, oh, he's so misguided. He so misreads everything. He thinks Tom is going to hurt her because she's in fact going to say she's leaving him. And actually, he's standing outside. He's standing guard. It's dark. It's late at night. He stays out there till 4 a.m. And she has no concern for the fact that he is waiting outside. And she's willing to let him take the fall for that accident. And then, of course, what's really heartbreaking at the end is what happens after he dies. And Nick realizes what? She doesn't even, not only does she disappear because she takes a trip with Tom, but she actually doesn't even send a note. She doesn't acknowledge it at all at the end.
Right.
Yeah. Any other comments? Okay, I'm looking a little bit at the time, and I do want to, I want to ask you this. Do you think, first of all, that Gatsby definitely loved Daisy? Did he love Daisy?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Leslie, you're saying,
I don't know that I thought he was in love with her. I don't know that he knew the meaning of love. She surely didn't. I thought he was in lust with her, and I thought that he was enamored by the fact that she was a rich girl. And I think, you know, he bought the total package. I don't even think he knew what love was. To me, Daisy was like a beautifully iced cake with beautifully icing on a rotten cake.
yeah, oh, interesting. Okay, that's a good image there. To me, what he did was Gatsby made Daisy the symbol of everything he valued, and he did not see her at all. This is what we mean about reality versus the dream. He didn't really see her as she really might have been. Nothing more than beautiful, rich, bored, and idle, with no moral strength, no sense of loyalty. She was just that green light. It signaled everything that he was idealizing at that time. And he's, of course, at the end, it's so pathetic. He's waiting for Daisy to call. And finally, the thought is that maybe he did realize at the very end, right before he was shot, perhaps he realized then that she was not going to call. Okay, I want to just kind of move on here because I think, did you all get the feeling that, how did you feel at the end of the book?
Sad.
Sad. It's very sad at the end, isn't it? Very sad when it shows up. What about the idea of the father coming? What did you make of that? Why does Fitzgerald make a point of the father showing up at the funeral?
To show who Gatsby really was and who he came from, and not all the stories that he made up. It's a bit of the truth.
At the end of the day, blood is thicker than water, and the father, even though he wasn't involved in his life, it was still his father, and he ended up the only one who cared enough to come.
Exactly true. But the other thing that I thought was really ironic is that his father, that was the one person he was trying to hide. Gatsby was trying to hide, was his father. And here his father is the one who shows up.
Right.
But the other thing that struck me about it was his father's pride. So picture that his father is grieving, and when his father actually comes into the house, and Nick says, when he looked around him now, speaking of the father, for the first time and saw the height and the splendor of the hall and the rooms opening out into other rooms, his grief began to be mixed with an awed pride. He's taking such pride in his son's accomplishment. And again, it shows you, that's how people feel about people who attain the American dream. His father says he had such a big future before him. He was only a young man, but he had a lot of brain power. If he'd lived, he'd have been a great man. He'd have helped to build the country. So it makes it even sadder, doesn't it?
Yes,
That his father had such hopes for him. And
he carried that photograph around that the son sent him of the house, and he was so proud of the house and that accomplishment.
Right.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, Nick moves back to the Midwest, and he's totally disillusioned. So what was it that what happened? What happened to him? What did he see? What did he conclude? Well, for one thing, he realizes that Tom and Daisy, and of course he's speaking, I think, in general of that class. He says they are people who up things, people who retreat back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and they let other people clean up the mess they made. So he's just filled with he's repulsed by what he saw in the East. And going back to Marilyn's comment in the very beginning, he's really contrasting it to his Midwestern values. And he really believes that all of the people, all of them really started in Midwest, and they moved to the East. And he faults the lure of the East Coast for all that happened. So what do you think? What do you think the book conveys? What message do you take away from this? Any thoughts?
Extreme wealth and extravagance is not the answer. That's not the answer. They end up dead. They end up not contributing anything. Their lives are meaningless.
What else?
That's not the answer.
Right.
I think the search for the American I don't know. Can I speak? I think that the search for the American dream is not going to be found if what you're searching for is what the people in this book were searching for.
With only wealth.
You're going to find the American dream, which exists. It's not from the choices that these people are choosing to find it.
I think he's making all of those points. I think he's showing the corruption and the decay of our moral society. The idea that people are are saying that the American dream is only this pursuit of wealth, this greed for money. So he's making a strong statement about that. I think he's also making the statement that Jane started to touch on, that the American dream can be very lonely if you don't have love. I mean, a big empty house. Ironic, the only time he ever went in his pool was at the very end. He had all of this beauty around him and he couldn't even enjoy it. Anything else that I thought was there? A couple of other things. What about hypocrisy? I thought this was great. Everyone loved to drink. Did you ever see so much alcohol prevalent in a story as in this story? And yet it was illegal to be drinking in Prohibition. The aristocracy was buying all this liquor, and yet look how they looked at bootleggers. They looked down at them. Then there were the stock markets and the bond traders. And he makes a point of the fine line between those who were criminals and those who were just labeled smart investors. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, the whole hypocrisy of marriages that look good and in fact aren't. So you see a lot of that in the story as well. Anything else?
The critics make a lot about the last line, saying that Scott Fitzgerald created the most beautiful last line in literature. And the last line is talking about going back into the past. You know, it says, we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So I guess maybe, you know, trying to have a better future could be useless, that we're always going to be involved and affected by our past.
I think you're 100% correct on that, because that's exactly what I think. And looking at a lot of what the reviews said, a lot of them all agreed with that, Leslie. What they talk about is the fact that the past is really what fuels our future. And you have to transcend the past. Often what happens though, and this is the idea of that last line, when they talk, why was this book a classic? One of the things was they talk about is the imperishable prose. So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. The idea that as we row forward, and he uses the lines in there that they're rowing harder and their arms are going to be stronger and they're going to go forward. The whole idea that we're trying to have these goals, but very often the goals are elusive and they seem to get further and further away. Gatsby was trying to recreate 1917. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further. That's the optimism and the hope. But he spends all of his energy in pursuit of a goal that is moving further and further away. So that's really one of the beauties of that line, and one of the beauties of the themes in the book. So then again, why is this a classic? So what they say is, first of all, that it is, what is the definition of a classic? It's a piece of literature that usually expresses artistic quality, has stood the test of time, and has universal appeal. So what I see in this book is that human nature does not change. Today, the American dream is still very much alive. We are all still striving towards goals. The self-made man in America is just part of our DNA, the idea of success, a self-made man. And of course, many times Americans pay a great price for that American dream. So that's one of the things they talk about, the idea of the self-made man. That's just part of us, and it continues to be part of us. Secondly, is because the book talks about the Roaring '20s and really captures the essence of this time period. And thirdly, we touched on this before, the idea that the characters will always be relevant because our impression and our interpretation of them changes as the years go on. One of the things I thought about, and I don't know if you had the same edition I had, but in the foreword of the book, it says that this book is seen very differently when teenagers look at the book and they analyze Gatsby. And they look at it differently than we look at it as adults. How do you think teenagers see this book? How do you think they see Gatsby? How do they see him? I think they really understand Gatsby's obsessive love, because that's what teenagers do. They experience that themselves. They don't have the hindsight that we have as adults. we see that this was obsessive behavior that Gatsby was displaying. They don't. They just see this. They just understand this kind of love. They see it very differently than we do.
He's like a rock star to them.
That's right. He's just really, he's trying so hard. They don't understand that his goal. I'm sorry, I don't know where you guys left me off there, but they don't see that his goal was elusive because it was an illusion. And the fourth thing is the whole idea of this narcissistic obsession with the past. That's one of the reasons they call it crazy love. You know, the idea that that's why this book will always have an audience because of that. And the fifth thing, of course, is the prose. So these are the reasons why they consider this book to still be a classic. I'm hoping that you guys enjoyed the conversation. Those of you that didn't enjoy the book, I hope you enjoyed the conversation about the book more than the book. And for the rest of us, I just, I know I really savored reading this book because I found the prose to be so beautiful and for the book and the themes to be so thought-provoking. I hope you all enjoyed it too. Any last thoughts you want to bring up?
Thank you, Lynda.
Thank you.
Never disappointing, always wonderful, always.
Always great
And,
meeting with everybody.
This was very enlightening. I appreciate everything.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm glad. It's great to see everybody, and we're going to see you next month with the
Jojo
Giver of
Moyes.
Stars.
Yeah.
The Giver of
Giver of
Stars.
Stars by Jojo Moyes on January 19th. And the registration is open if you want to go ahead and do that. And again, we thank everybody, especially our friends from the Sterling Road Library who are partners on this. And it was, as always, Lynda, wonderful. So thank you so much for doing this. And everybody, happy holidays, stay healthy, and we will see you in the new year.
Happy Hanukkah, guys. Okay, we'll see you.
Thank you, Linda.
Bye. Great to see you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.